Welcome back to Coremates. This is a space for slow conversations in a fast world. A place where we don't rush to fix ourselves, but try to understand ourselves a little more clearly, emotionally, psychologically, and humanly. Today, we're talking about something that almost everyone thinks they understand. A word that sounds gentle, harmless, even obvious. Gratitude. And already, some people feel open, while others feel resistant. Because gratitude has been packaged in a very specific way. As positivity, as optimism, as something you're supposed to feel when life is going well. But this episode isn't about that version. I'm joined today by Elen, and together we want to explore gratitude not as a performance, not as a moral obligation, and not as a way to silence pain, but as something far more complex and far more powerful. Because what if gratitude isn't about being positive at all? What if it's about being honest? There's a moment most of us know. You're standing somewhere ordinary. Maybe in your kitchen, maybe in traffic, maybe scrolling late at night. And someone says you should be grateful. And instead of feeling calm, something tightens. Because sometimes gratitude feels fake. Sometimes it feels forced. Sometimes it feels like something people talk about when they haven't been where you are. Yeah. Sometimes gratitude sounds like denial. Like being told to look at the bright side when the dark side is the only honest thing in the room. And when life hurts, when you're tired, overwhelmed, grieving, or just quietly disappointed, gratitude can feel almost offensive. Exactly. Because we've been taught that gratitude means saying everything is fine, when inside, it clearly isn't. But what if that's the misunderstanding? What if gratitude was never meant to erase pain, but to help you survive it? What if gratitude isn't about pretending life is good, but about seeing what's real, even inside difficulty? Because seeing clearly doesn't mean ignoring what's missing. It means also noticing what's still here. And that's where this conversation begins. Not with positivity, not with affirmations, but with perception. Because real gratitude isn't loud. It doesn't shout happiness. It quietly shifts how your mind relates to reality. And when that happens, your brain changes, your relationships soften, your sense of meaning deepens, and your daily life becomes a little less heavy to carry. This episode isn't about forcing gratitude. It's not about bypassing pain or comparing suffering. It's about understanding gratitude's real power, psychologically, socially, spiritually, and in the small moments of everyday life. So if you've ever struggled with the idea of gratitude, if it's ever felt fake, distant, or impossible, this conversation is for you. So before we go any further, I think we need to pause here, because gratitude is one of those words that carries a lot of baggage. Everyone thinks they know what it means, but most of us are reacting not to gratitude itself, but to a distorted version of it.
Yes.
A version that's been simplified, commercialized, and honestly misused. Because when people hear gratitude, what many of them actually hear is, "Don't complain." Or worse, "Other people have it worse, so be quiet." And that's not gratitude. That's emotional dismissal. Let's be really clear about what gratitude is not, because this is where people get stuck. Gratitude is not toxic positivity. It's not smiling through pain. It's not forcing yourself to feel thankful when your nervous system is overwhelmed. And it's definitely not denial. Gratitude doesn't ask you to pretend that something didn't hurt, or that a loss didn't matter, or that disappointment didn't leave a mark. If anything, real gratitude requires honesty first, because you can't be grateful for what you haven't allowed yourself to see. It's also not settling for less. That's a big myth. People worry that if they practice gratitude, they'll lose their ambition, that they'll accept situations that should change. But gratitude doesn't say, "This is enough forever." It says, "This is what exists right now, and I'm willing to look at it clearly."
Exactly.
Gratitude isn't resignation. It's awareness. And awareness doesn't shrink your life. It grounds it. When gratitude is real, it becomes about contrast, about noticing what's present without erasing what's missing, about holding perspective without invalidating pain. This is where it gets really interesting psychologically, because gratitude isn't actually an emotion in the way we usually think about emotions. It's not like joy or sadness that just appears. It's a cognitive process, a way the mind organizes experience.
Yes.
Gratitude is something the brain does, not something it magically feels. It's the mind learning to widen the frame, to zoom out just enough to say, this hurts. And something meaningful still exists alongside it. And that's important, because the human brain is capable of holding more than one truth at the same time. We tend to think it's either slash or. Either I'm suffering or I'm grateful. Either life is hard or life is good. But psychologically, that's not how the mind works when it's healthy. A regulated mind can hold pain and appreciation simultaneously, without one canceling the other out. That's the part people don't expect. Gratitude doesn't erase suffering. It contextualizes it. It says, this moment is painful, but it's not the entire story of my existence. And that subtle shift changes how the nervous system experiences reality. And maybe this is the most important distinction of all. You don't become grateful instead of being hurt. You become grateful while being human. You don't wait for life to be easy. You practice gratitude inside the complexity, inside the mess, the uncertainty, the unfinished parts. Which is why real gratitude feels quieter than the version we're sold. It's not loud optimism. It's not constant happiness. It's a steady internal voice that says, I can acknowledge what's broken without losing sight of what still matters. And once gratitude is understood this way, not as pressure, but as perception, it stops feeling fake. It stops feeling like something reserved for privileged moments, and starts becoming something deeply human and surprisingly resilient. You know what shifted everything for me when I started reading about this? Realizing that gratitude isn't some poetic idea floating above reality, it's something the brain actually does. Something physical. Something measurable. And once you see that, it stops feeling abstract.
Yes.
It becomes very grounded. Because the brain doesn't care about affirmations or aesthetics, it cares about patterns, signals, and regulation. When gratitude is practiced, even quietly, even imperfectly, the brain starts engaging different systems than the ones we usually live in when we're anxious or overwhelmed. One of the first places that lights up is the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for meaning-making, perspective, and integration. And I love that word, integration. Because gratitude isn't about bypassing pain, it's about placing pain inside a wider mental frame where it no longer consumes everything.
Exactly.
When we're stuck in stress or fear, the brain narrows. It becomes hyper-focused on threat, on what's wrong, on what's missing. Gratitude gently widens that frame again. It reminds the brain that there is more information available than just danger. And then there's dopamine, which people often misunderstand. Gratitude doesn't create dopamine in the way scrolling or instant rewards do. It doesn't spike it. It stabilizes it. It teaches the brain to associate motivation with presence, not escape. That's such an important distinction. Because gratitude isn't passive at all, it's regulatory. It actively reduces how reactive the amygdala becomes, the part of the brain that scans for threat, stress, rejection, and fear. And when that system calms down even slightly, the nervous system stops living in constant alert mode. Which is why people often say gratitude makes them feel lighter, even when nothing has changed externally. Not because their problems disappeared, but because their nervous system stopped gripping those problems so tightly. This is where gratitude becomes deeply practical. When the brain repeatedly practices noticing what's supportive, meaningful, or stabilizing, it interrupts rumination, that endless mental loop where the mind replays the same worries again and again. Not by force, but by offering the brain an alternative focus. And that matters for anxiety and low mood because so much of both isn't about what's happening, it's about how long the mind stays there. Gratitude shortens the emotional echo of pain. It doesn't say, don't feel this. It says, you don't have to live inside this forever. You see it in sleep too. When the brain isn't constantly scanning for unresolved threat, the body recovers more deeply. Gratitude doesn't knock you out at night. It signals safety just enough for rest to happen. And over time, that builds resilience. Not the dramatic kind. The quiet kind. The kind where you still feel things but you recover faster. You don't spiral as long. You don't stay stuck in emotional aftershocks. This might be the most important thing to understand. Gratitude doesn't change your life circumstances. It changes how long pain stays in your nervous system. And that difference is everything. Because suffering isn't just about events. It's about duration. About how long the body holds tension after the moment has passed. Gratitude gently tells the nervous system, you can loosen now. Not because everything is okay, but because not everything is a threat anymore. And maybe this is a good moment to pause. Just notice, without judgment, how often your mind automatically scans for what's missing, what hasn't worked out yet, what still feels unresolved. And then notice how rarely it scans for what's holding you, what's stabilizing you, what's quietly supporting you right now. Not to force gratitude, just to observe the imbalance. Because awareness is always the first step. And gratitude, at its core, begins there. You know what's interesting? Once you start understanding gratitude inside the nervous system, you realize it was never meant to stay there, inside you. It wants to move outward, into relationships, into how we look at other people. Yes, because gratitude isn't just an internal reframe, it's social glue. When gratitude is expressed, not just felt, it does something very specific in relationships. It creates emotional safety. People soften. They relax. They feel seen. And trust grows there. Not the dramatic kind, but the quiet trust that says, I matter here. Gratitude tells the other person, I notice you. Your presence registers in my life. That's incredibly regulating for the human nervous system. There's a huge difference between feeling grateful and expressing gratitude. Feeling it stays internal. Expressing it creates connection. Because when you express gratitude, you're not just naming an action. You're affirming the relationship. And that affirmation invites generosity. Not obligation, generosity. People naturally want to give more when they feel appreciated, not demanded. Gratitude says, you're already enough. Expectation says, you need to prove yourself. And empathy grows there too. Because when you practice gratitude toward someone, you start noticing the effort behind their behavior, not just the behavior itself. You see context. You see humanity. Think about friendships. How many friendships don't end with a fight, they just fade? Not because there wasn't care, but because there wasn't acknowledgement. Feeling unseen slowly drains closeness. Yes. When someone feels appreciated for who they are, their consistency, their listening, their quiet support, it strengthens the bond in a way that no amount of casual conversation can. Gratitude makes people feel counted. In romantic relationships, this becomes even more delicate. There's a point where appreciation turns into expectation. And suddenly, what someone does is no longer seen as a gift, but as a requirement. And that shift is dangerous. Because appreciation keeps love alive. Expectation turns love into labor. When gratitude disappears, partners stop feeling chosen. They start feeling used. And in families, this might be the hardest place of all. So many families don't lack love. They lack recognition. People do emotional labor quietly for years without ever being thanked. And resentment grows not from conflict, but from invisibility. Gratitude in families can break generational cycles. Sometimes simply saying, I see how hard you tried, does more healing than years of explaining pain. Here's the hard truth. Many relationships don't fail because of conflict. They fail because of unnoticed effort. Because humans can endure difficulty, but they struggle deeply with being unseen. Gratitude isn't about politeness. It's about recognition. And recognition is one of the deepest emotional needs we have. So maybe pause for a moment. When was the last time you thanked someone? Not for what they did, but for who they've been in your life. Not a grand gesture, just honest noticing. Because gratitude doesn't just strengthen relationships. It reminds people they matter, and that changes everything. You know, when we talk about gratitude only as a psychological tool or a habit, something important gets lost. Because gratitude didn't start as a productivity technique. It existed long before neuroscience could explain it. Exactly. Across cultures and centuries, gratitude wasn't about feeling good. It was about staying connected to life itself. In Eastern philosophies, gratitude is presence. Noticing what is, without immediately trying to change it. Just being with reality, fully. In Stoicism, it looks different, but it carries the same depth. Gratitude becomes humility. An understanding that not everything is in your control, and that fighting reality only creates more suffering. There's a quiet strength in saying, this is what's here right now. And in spiritual traditions, gratitude often shows up as grace. Not because life is perfect, but because life is still happening with you. Even in pain, even in loss, gratitude becomes a way of saying, I'm not alone in this experience. What I love about this is how universal it is. Different languages, different beliefs, but the same human need to anchor ourselves to something larger than fear. Gratitude creates that anchor.
Yes.
It reminds us that life isn't only something we control or optimize, it's something we participate in. And that shift changes how people carry hardship. This becomes especially clear during loss. When something breaks, ends, or disappears, gratitude doesn't deny the pain. It doesn't say, be thankful and move on. It says, this mattered. And that's profound, because grief is love with nowhere to go, and gratitude gives it a place to land. It allows meaning to coexist with sadness. The same is true in uncertainty and transitions. Moments where the future is unclear, where identity is shifting, where answers haven't arrived yet. Gratitude doesn't solve those moments. It steadies you inside them. It's a form of existential courage. The courage to stay present without guarantees. To keep your heart open even when certainty is gone. That's why gratitude isn't about answers. It's about orientation. Gratitude doesn't answer life's questions. It helps you live without needing all the answers. And maybe that's why gratitude has survived every era, every philosophy, every belief system. Because at its core, it's not about optimism. It's about belonging. To life. To meaning. To the moment you're in. And once gratitude lives there, not as a rule, but as a relationship with life, it naturally begins to show up in how we live day to day. Not forced. Not scripted. Just embodied. This is usually the moment where people start pulling away a little. Because the word practice immediately brings up images of journals, routines, morning rituals, things you either keep up with perfectly or abandon completely. And that's exactly why most gratitude practices fail. They're built for an ideal version of a person, calm, consistent, emotionally available every day. But real life isn't like that. Most practices are too abstract. They ask you to be grateful for your life or list 3 things you're thankful for, without helping you connect to anything real in your body or your actual day. So gratitude stays intellectual, not lived. They're also too forced. When you tell yourself to feel grateful, especially during stress or pain, the nervous system resists. It feels like pressure, like emotional bypassing. And often they're disconnected from reality. They don't meet people where they actually are tired, overwhelmed, uncertain. So people don't fail at gratitude. Gratitude practices fail people. What works is much smaller than people think. Micro-gratitude. Moments that last 10 to 30 seconds, not minutes. Just long enough to notice something specific. Not your whole life. Not your future. Not a positive story. Just this. The warmth of the cup in your hands. The fact that someone texted back. The moment your shoulders drop when you exhale. That's because the nervous system responds to specificity, not slogans. Small, concrete awareness rewires faster than big declarations. Another shift is reframing moments, not entire days. Instead of saying, today was good, you notice. This 5-minute walk helped my mind slow down. This conversation made me feel less alone. This pause mattered. And one of the most powerful forms of gratitude is practicing it during difficulty, not after it's resolved. Not waiting for relief. Not waiting for clarity. But noticing support while you're still inside the struggle. Take gratitude journaling. It works, but only when it's sensory. Not, I'm grateful for my job. But, I'm grateful for the quiet moment before my first meeting. I'm grateful that I could step outside and feel the air on my face. Or, during stress, Instead of forcing calm, you reframe gently. You notice, my body is trying to protect me. I'm reacting because something matters. That's gratitude for your own nervous system, not fighting it. And then there's gratitude as noticing support systems. Not just people, but structures. The floor holding you. The routine that steadies you. The skill you've built without realizing it. This is where gratitude stops being self-improvement and becomes self-attunement. Listening instead of fixing. Noticing instead of judging. You're not trying to become a better person. You're trying to be more present with the one you already are. And when gratitude is practiced this way, it doesn't demand energy. It gives it back. I think one of the reasons gratitude feels heavy for so many people is because it comes with rules that were never meant to exist. Unspoken rules. Yes, and most of those rules are rooted in fear. Fear that if you're grateful, you'll lose your right to be angry. Or that gratitude means you should tolerate things that are actually hurting you. Myth 1. If I'm grateful, I can't be angry. This one shows up everywhere. People feel anger rise and immediately shut it down with guilt. I shouldn't feel this way. I have so much to be thankful for, but anger and gratitude don't cancel each other out. Anger is information. Gratitude is awareness. They can exist in the same moment. You can be grateful for your job and still angry about how you're treated. Grateful for a relationship and still angry about unmet needs. Suppressing anger doesn't make you grateful. It just makes you disconnected. Myth 2. Gratitude means I should accept everything. This myth is especially dangerous because it turns gratitude into endurance. And gratitude was never meant to teach people how to tolerate harm. You can be grateful and set boundaries. Grateful and leave. Grateful and say no. Gratitude doesn't mean resignation. It means clarity. It helps you see what nourishes you and what doesn't. Myth 3. People with hard lives can't practice gratitude. This one is painful because it assumes gratitude belongs to the lucky. But historically, gratitude has been practiced most deeply by people who had the least certainty. Not because their lives were easy, but because gratitude helped them survive. Gratitude isn't a privilege of comfort. It's a response to reality. Myth 4. Gratitude is weak or passive. This belief usually comes from confusing gratitude with compliance. But gratitude doesn't make you passive. It actually strengthens your nervous system. It gives you the steadiness to act without panic. Gratitude can coexist with ambition, with drive, with change, with grief. Gratitude doesn't make you smaller. It makes you steadier. And steadiness is what allows people to face reality without collapsing or hardening. Which is why gratitude isn't about being nice. It's about being rooted. One of the most freeing things about gratitude is that it doesn't come as a single package you either own or don't. It changes shape depending on the life you're living. And that means the way you practice it at 20 is going to look very different from the way you practice it at 50, and neither is more authentic. They're simply suited to different needs. Yes, and when we say it adapts, we mean it in a practical way. For young people, gratitude often functions as a kind of grounding tool for identity because adolescence and early adulthood are full of shifts and comparisons, and the simple act of noticing one small, steady thing about yourself or your life can create a matchstick of coherence in a room that otherwise feels like it's constantly rearranging. So for teens and young adults, gratitude might be as modest as acknowledging a small competence. I did show up to that class even though I was scared, or naming a relationship that didn't abandon them, and those tiny acknowledgments start knitting together a sense of who they are over time. Which is why identity grounding through gratitude is such a gentle but powerful practice in those years. For people in midlife, the form shifts. Gratitude often becomes a practical buffer against burnout, not a platitude, but a deliberate recalibration that says, I can hold the exhaustion and also notice the sustaining things. Maybe the colleague who covered a shift, the routine that structures your day, or the small successes that are invisible on performance trackers but vital to your capacity to keep going. Exactly, gratitude in adulthood is often less shiny and more pragmatic. It's not about exalting big wins. It's about recognizing the quiet scaffolding, the systems, the people, the skills. that prevent collapse, and that recognition works psychologically like scaffolding for the nervous system, reminding you that you're standing on something stable even when the work feels endless. And then there are the crisis seasons: illness, grief, job loss, heartbreak, when gratitude looks nothing like cheerful lists and everything like psychological oxygen. Short, sometimes single-line acknowledgments that simply say, "I'm still breathing. Someone sat with me today. I felt a moment of less pain." Statements that are thin but surviving, and they function less as performance and more as lifelines. In those moments, gratitude is almost surgical. It's careful, precise, and deeply honest, not denying the loss, not smoothing it over, but locating whatever small steadiness remains and using it as a foothold to keep moving through days that otherwise refuse to be stitched together. And for older adults, gratitude often becomes about legacy and meaning. People name the relationships that shaped them, the ordinary rituals that gave structure to decades, and the surprising small mercies that felt like proof that their life had texture. And in those testimonies, gratitude helps turn a long, complicated life into a narrative that can be held with dignity rather than confusion. So across life stages, the content of gratitude changes: competence and identity for youth, scaffolding and replenishment for midlife, survival notes in crisis, and legacy-making in later years. But the structural function is constant. Gratitude points attention toward the ties that keep us human. And this adaptation also shows up in everyday settings. At work, gratitude might be noticing small competencies, the colleague who offered a helpful edit, or the tiny efficiencies that make a day manageable. In creativity, it's the gratitude for curiosity itself, for the half-formed idea that visits and doesn't leave you empty-handed. In healing, gratitude can be the small recognition that your body did one thing differently today, like a breath that didn't catch or a night's sleep that felt a little longer. And in transitions, gratitude can act as a compass, naming what you're leaving and what you're taking with you, even when the future is unclear. Those examples show why a one-size-fits-all gratitude practice fails. Work contexts need practices that respect boundaries and time. Creative work needs practices that protect play and small wins. Healing needs practices that are somatic and patient. Transitions need practices that hold ambiguity, not close it too soon. And the emotional insight here, the heart of what we're saying, is that gratitude is not a static skill you acquire and then apply uniformly. It is an adaptive posture you cultivate so you can respond to life's demands with more nuance, which in turn makes your reactions less reactive and more considered. So wherever you are, whether you're figuring out who you are, running yourself thin, walking through loss, or looking back on decades, gratitude will ask different things of you, and that's actually a relief. It means you don't have to perform some universal standard. You just have to learn how to notice what steadies you in the particular moment you're living. You know, when I think back to that little moment we opened with, the quiet coffee, noticing the small ordinary things, I realize that's exactly where gratitude begins. Not with grand declarations, not with lists or Instagram-worthy insights, but in the simple act of noticing what we usually rush past.
Yes.
And the magic is that noticing doesn't have to be performance. It doesn't have to come with rules or outcomes. Gratitude isn't a checklist. It isn't something you do to fix your life or prove you're a good person. It's simply awareness.
Seeing.
Pausing long enough to let life register inside you. Exactly. And I think that's why people resist it sometimes. They hear gratitude and imagine it means pretending everything is perfect or denying how heavy life can feel. But the truth is, it's the opposite. Gratitude doesn't erase the pain. It doesn't pretend. It just makes space for life to be exactly what it is and lets us notice what's sustaining us along the way. And that space, that noticing, it's like a small shift in your nervous system, a quiet recalibration, one moment of seeing, without judgment, without fixing. And over time, those moments build trust in yourself, trust that you can experience both the hard and the tender, the loss and the connection, without being swept away. So maybe the real question isn't, what should I be grateful for? It's, what am I overlooking because I'm rushing past my life? And today, right now, you don't have to solve it. You don't have to change it. You can just notice one small thing: the warmth of your coffee, the sound of your breath, a person who showed up, or even the fact that you're still here listening. No fixing. No forcing. Just seeing. And letting that tiny awareness stretch the space around you a little, so tomorrow, maybe you notice a little more. And that's the quiet shift. That's the real work of gratitude. Thank you for sitting with us today. We'll be back next Sunday at 10 a.m. with a new conversation, another way to see your life, to question, and to grow.